Alright, this happened a few years back when I was working at a small retail store. It was one of those places that sold everything from home goods to electronics. Nothing fancy, just your typical neighborhood store where locals came in for random things. I was working part-time while finishing school, and most of the shifts were pretty chill. But this one night, things got weird. Really weird. It was a quiet Wednesday night. The store was pretty dead, and I was working the closing shift with one other guy, Mike. He was one of those guys who didn't really care much about the job. Just showed up, did his hours, and left. We weren't close or anything, but we got along well enough. Anyway, we were getting ready to close up the store. There was maybe an hour left, and Mike was up front handling the last couple of customers while I was in the back room, organizing some stock. Now, this back room, I never liked it. It wasn't like it was haunted or anything, but it had this weird, heavy vibe. It was dimly lit, had no windows, and was colder than the rest of the store, which didn't make any sense because we didn't have air conditioning back there. Just these old fluorescent lights that buzzed like crazy, and there was this smell, like damp cardboard and cleaning supplies, that never went away, no matter how many times we cleaned. That night, I was back there alone, sorting through some new inventory that had come in earlier. The boxes were all piled up in this messy stack, and my job was to unpack them, check the items against the inventory list, and put everything on the shelves. I'd been back there for maybe 20 minutes, just doing my thing, when I heard this noise. At first I thought it was just Mike messing around. It was this faint scraping sound, like something was being dragged across the floor. I stopped for a second and listened, but then it went quiet. I figured maybe he had come back to grab something and didn't say anything. So I shrugged it off and kept working. But a few minutes later, I heard it again. This time it was louder, like something heavy was being pushed across the concrete floor. I turned around, expecting to see Mike, but the back room was empty. I called out to him, but there was no answer. I thought maybe he was still up front dealing with customers, so I brushed it off again. But now I was feeling a little on edge. The weird thing about that back room was how quiet it got. The front of the store wasn't that far away, but once you were back there, it was like you were completely cut off from everything. The store's usual sounds, the music playing, the hum of conversation, didn't reach back there. It was just you and the buzzing of the lights. I tried to focus on my work, but that noise kept playing in the back of my mind. It was like someone, or something, was moving around back there, but I couldn't see anyone. I told myself I was just being paranoid, but after hearing it a third time, louder than before, I decided to check it out. I grabbed my phone and used the flashlight because the back corner of the room was always a bit darker. I walked over to where the noise seemed to be coming from, near the far wall, where we kept the older stock that hadn't sold in months. The air felt colder the closer I got, and my stomach was doing that thing where you just asterisk something's off, but you can't figure out why. When I shone the flashlight over the shelves, I noticed something that didn't make sense. One of the shelves was pushed slightly away from the wall, like it had been moved. I'd been in that back room 1,000 times, and those shelves never moved. They were heavy, industrial ones, meant to stay in place. I crouched down to take a closer look, and that's when I saw it. There was a small door behind the shelf. Now, I had never seen this door before, and I'd been working there for almost a year. It was small, maybe just tall enough for someone to crawl through, and it looked old. The paint was peeling, and the edges were rusted. It was like the door had been there forever, but had been hidden behind the shelves this whole time. My first thought was to go get Mike, but something stopped me. I don't know what it was. Maybe curiosity, maybe something else. But I decided to check it out on my own. I grabbed the edge of the shelf and slowly slid it aside just enough to fit through. The door had no handle, just a small latch. I hesitated for a second, thinking maybe this was a bad idea, but then I lifted the latch and pushed the door open. Behind the door was a narrow hallway. It was pitch black, and the air coming out of it was colder than the back room. My phone's flashlight barely reached a few feet into the hallway, but from what I could see, the walls were made of the same rough concrete as the back room. The floor was dusty, like no one had walked there in years. I should have turned around right then and there, but something pushed me to keep going. I stepped through the door and into the hallway. The moment I did, I felt this weird pressure, like the air was heavier on the other side. The walls were so close I could touch both sides if I stretched my arms out, and the floor felt uneven under my shoes. I walked slowly, shining my flashlight ahead of me, but the further I went, the darker it seemed to get, like the light was being swallowed up by the shadows. After walking for what felt like forever, but was probably just a minute, I reached the end of the hallway. There was another door, this one bigger and made of metal. It was rusted and dented, and the handle was barely hanging on. I grabbed it and pulled, and the door creaked open with this loud groaning sound, like it hadn't been opened in years. Inside was a small room, maybe the size of a walk-in closet. The walls were lined with shelves, but instead of stock or supplies, they were filled with old, dusty boxes and files. In the middle of the room was a single wooden chair, and next to it was a small table with a stack of papers on it. There was no light in the room, just the faint glow from my phone's flashlight. I stepped inside, and the first thing I noticed was the smell. It was musty, like mildew and old paper, but there was something else too. Something metallic, like the smell of rust or old pipes. The air was thick, almost suffocating, and I felt a cold sweat break out on the back of my neck. I walked over to the table and picked up one of the papers. It was covered in handwriting, but it was so faded I could barely make it out. It looked like a list of some kind, but the words didn't make any sense. They were just random letters and numbers, scribbled like someone had written them in a hurry. I was about to put the paper down when I heard the door behind me slam shut. I spun around, my flashlight shaking in my hand, but the hallway was empty. The door was closed, just like it had been when I first found it. I ran over and grabbed the handle, but it wouldn't budge. I pulled harder, but it was like the door had been locked from the other side. That's when I heard the noise again. It was the same scraping sound I'd heard before, but this time it was coming from inside the room with me. My heart was racing, and I felt like I couldn't breathe. I shone my flashlight around the room, trying to find the source of the noise, but there was nothing there, just the shelves and the boxes. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something move. I turned the flashlight toward the back of the room, and for a split second, I thought I saw a shadow. Something tall and thin, just barely visible in the dim light. My stomach dropped, and I felt this wave of cold wash over me. I blinked, and the shadow was gone. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in place, but eventually, I forced myself to move. I ran to the door, yanked on the handle with all my strength, and finally, it opened. I bolted down the hallway, back into the back room, and slammed the hidden door shut behind me. When I got back to the front, Mike was still up there, counting the cash in the register. He looked up at me like I was crazy, but I didn't say anything. I just grabbed my stuff and told him I had to leave early. I never went back into that back room again. In fact, I quit a couple of weeks later. I don't know what I saw that night, and honestly, I don't want to know. But sometimes when I'm lying in bed at night, I think about that hallway, that room, and whatever was moving in the shadows. And I can't help but wonder, what was it and why was it hidden away behind that door? Alright, this is something that happened to me a while back when I used to work at this small convenience store. You know the kind, nothing fancy, just a place people popped into to grab snacks, cigarettes, or maybe a six-pack after work. The hours were long, but the job itself was easy. Most of the time, it was just me and one other coworker on the night shifts, since things would slow down after 8 p.m. The store had a back room, like most places, where we kept extra stock. It wasn't huge or anything, but it was enough space for a few shelves packed with random items and supplies. The back room also doubled as the break room. Not the kind of place you wanted to hang out, though. It had no windows, the lighting was dim and flickered sometimes, and the air was always stale. No matter how many times we tried to prop the door open to let it air out, something about that room always felt off. I couldn't really explain it, but whenever I had to go back there alone, I never stayed any longer than I had to. I just grabbed whatever stock I needed and got out of there. Anyway, one night I was closing the store with my coworker, Dave. We'd had a slow night, only a few customers here and there. So by the time it hit 9 p.m., the place was empty, and we were just going through the motions of closing up. Dave was handling the register, counting the cash, and I was in the back room, doing inventory and restocking a few things for the morning shift. I had my phone out, playing some music while I worked. It was routine stuff, stacking boxes, checking expiration dates, all the boring things that make the time crawl by. The back room was always kind of creepy, but it wasn't anything I hadn't gotten used to by then. I just kept my head down and did my job. But that night, something felt different. I didn't realize it at first, but there was this tension in the air, like the room was waiting for something. I know that sounds dramatic, but that's the best way I can describe it. The place was dead silent, except for the hum of the old fluorescent lights. I remember thinking it was weird that I couldn't hear anything from the store. Usually, even if it was quiet, I'd hear Dave moving around, or the faint sound of the store radio playing some old pop hits. But that night, nothing. It was just me, standing in the back room, surrounded by shelves of stock. I was stacking a few boxes on one of the higher shelves when I heard it, a soft sound, like a shuffle. At first I thought maybe Dave had come back there to grab something, but when I looked around, the room was empty. I shook it off, figuring I'd imagined it, or maybe a box had shifted. Things moved around in the back room all the time, especially when deliveries hadn't been stacked right. But then I heard it again. This time it was louder, a definite thud like something had fallen. It came from the far side of the back room, near the shelves we rarely used, the ones where we kept old cleaning supplies and random junk that never got touched. My stomach tightened, but I told myself it was nothing. Maybe a broom had fallen over or a box tipped. I grabbed my phone and switched on the flashlight. The back room didn't have great lighting, especially in the far corner where the shelves were, so I figured I'd check it out just to be sure. As I walked closer though, I noticed the temperature had dropped. Not drastically, but enough for me to feel a chill down my spine. I shrugged it off, thinking maybe it was just because I was in the back where the air didn't circulate as well. When I got to the shelves, everything looked normal at first glance, but then I noticed something strange. One of the shelves had been pushed away from the wall, just slightly. It was subtle, but enough that I could see a gap between the shelf and the wall. I couldn't remember ever moving that shelf, and I was pretty sure Dave hadn't touched it either. Curious, I crouched down and shone my flashlight into the gap, trying to see if anything had fallen behind it. That's when I saw something that made my heart race. Behind the shelf, hidden in the shadows, was a door. Now this wasn't a normal door. It was metal, with rusted edges and no handle, just a latch. I'd never noticed it before, and I'd been working in that store for months. It was like it had been hidden behind the shelf on purpose. My first thought was that it must have been some kind of maintenance door, maybe something the old owners had used but had long since forgotten about. But there was something about it that felt wrong, like it shouldn't have been there. Against my better judgment, I pulled the shelf aside just enough to reach the latch. My hands were shaking, and I wasn't even sure why. It's not like I expected anything crazy to happen, but the whole situation just felt off. I grabbed the latch and pulled. The door opened with a loud creak, and this cold, musty air hit me in the face. It smelled like a basement, damp, stale, like something had been left to rot. I shone my flashlight inside, and what I saw immediately made me regret opening that door. It was a narrow hallway, barely wide enough for one person to walk through. The walls were concrete, rough and cracked in places, and the floor was covered in dirt and debris. The air felt heavy, almost oppressive, and the further I looked down the hallway, the darker it got. I couldn't see the end, but I could feel something wrong. I don't know how to explain it, but it felt like I wasn't supposed to be there. I hesitated, my instincts screaming at me to close the door and walk away, but curiosity got the better of me. I stepped inside, my flashlight barely cutting through the darkness. Every step echoed off the walls, and the cold air seemed to get thicker the further I went. The hallway wasn't long, maybe 30 feet, but it felt like I was walking for miles. At the end of the hallway, there was another door, just like the first one. It was rusted, with no handle, only a latch. I don't know why, but I reached out and pulled it open. Inside was a small room, no bigger than a storage closet. The walls were bare, except for strange markings, scratches, like someone had been clawing at the concrete. And in the center of the room, there was a single wooden chair, old and splintered, sitting under a bare light bulb that wasn't even on. I stood there, frozen, staring at the chair. The air in the room was suffocating, like it was pressing down on me. My heart was pounding, and I had this overwhelming sense that I needed to leave, right now. But before I could move, I heard it, a soft scraping sound coming from behind me. I spun around, shining my flashlight back down the hallway, but there was nothing there, just the empty concrete walls. The scraping got louder though, closer, like something was dragging itself toward me. My whole body tensed up, and I wanted to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The sound kept getting closer, and I could feel the panic rising in my chest. My breathing got shallow, and my flashlight started shaking in my hand. I didn't want to see whatever was making that noise, but I couldn't stop myself from looking. There was nothing. The hallway was empty, but the sound, it was still there. I couldn't explain it. It was like the walls themselves were making the noise. Finally, I snapped out of it and bolted back down the hallway, slamming the door behind me as soon as I reached the back room. My heart was racing, and my hands were shaking so bad I almost dropped my phone. I leaned against the door, trying to catch my breath, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still there, watching me. I didn't tell Dave what happened. I just made up some excuse about feeling sick and left early. I never went back into that back room alone again. I didn't even go near that shelf, and as far as I know, that door is still back there, hidden behind the stock. To this day, I don't know what was behind that second door or what was making that scraping noise, but I'll tell you this, I'm never going back to find out. Alright, so this happened a couple of years ago when I was working at this small retail store in the strip mall. It was a quiet job, nothing too exciting, just stocking shelves, working the register, helping the occasional customer find something. I liked it well enough, but the part I always hated was being stuck in the back room. It wasn't that it was spooky at first, just boring. But after what happened, I couldn't walk into that room without feeling my stomach turn. The back room was where we kept all the extra inventory. You know, stuff that wouldn't fit on the floor or things we were holding for a sale. It was a pretty big room, lined with metal shelves from the floor to the ceiling, filled with boxes of products, random supplies, and old things that we didn't really use. The lights were those old fluorescent ones that buzzed and flickered every so often, which always gave me a slight headache. And, of course, there was no air circulation back there, so it always felt stuffy. So this one evening, I was closing up with my coworker, Emma. We were supposed to leave at 9 p.m., and it was already getting dark outside. We hadn't had any customers for the past hour, so it was basically just the two of us in the whole store. Emma was up front handling the last bits of paperwork for the night, and I was in the back room, getting things organized for the next day's shipment. I remember the feeling right away. The back room was colder than usual. It was weird because the temperature in that room was always either hot or sticky. But this time it felt like I'd stepped into a fridge. I tried not to think much about it and got to work. I had a few boxes to unload, and I wanted to get it done quickly so we could head out on time. I was maybe 10 minutes into unpacking when I heard this strange noise. It was this faint tapping, like something small hitting metal. At first I thought maybe it was one of the shelves settling, but the sound kept going. Tap, 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 steady, like someone tapping their fingers on a table. I stopped and listened for a second, but it went quiet. Probably just the old building, I told myself, and went back to my work. But the sound came again. Only this time, it was louder. It wasn't just tapping now. It was more like something shifting, like a box being dragged across the floor. It came from the far end of the back room, near where we kept the old stock we hadn't touched in months. That part of the back room was the creepiest. It was darker, the light didn't reach that far, and there were shelves stacked with stuff no one really bothered to check. I hadn't been back there in a while myself. Hearing that noise come from there gave me the chills. I wasn't about to leave without at least looking though. I grabbed my phone for some extra light and started walking toward the sound. My steps echoed off the concrete floor, and the further I got, the quieter it became, like the air was getting sucked out of the room. When I reached the far end, I saw something strange. One of the boxes had been pulled out of place. It wasn't much, just a few inches, but enough to notice. Now, there was no way that box had moved on its own. It was wedged between a bunch of other boxes and stacked pretty high. I stood there for a second, just staring at it, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. But before I could do anything, there was another noise. This time, it wasn't a tap or a scrape. It was a soft thud, like something hitting the floor. It came from behind the shelves, where there shouldn't have been anything. I stepped around the shelves to see what had fallen, and that's when I noticed something that I'd never seen before. There was a door, hidden behind the shelves. It was old, like really old. with peeling paint and a rusted handle. I'd worked in that store for months, and I had no idea this door even existed. I guess the shelves had been pushed far enough back that it had been hidden all this time. Curiosity got the better of me. I know it sounds stupid, but when you find something like that, you don't just walk away. I moved a few boxes aside, clearing space in front of the door, and reached out to try the handle. It was cold and stiff, like it hadn't been turned in years. I had to yank it a couple of times before the door finally creaked open. What was behind the door wasn't what I expected. It was a narrow hallway, barely wide enough for one person to walk through. The walls were made of rough concrete, and the floor looked uneven, like it hadn't been finished properly. It was dark, but my phone's flashlight showed just enough to see that the hallway went on for about 15 or 20 feet before it turned a corner. For a second, I thought about just shutting the door and walking away, but then I figured, what the hell, right? I had time to kill, and maybe it was just some old storage area no one used anymore. So I stepped inside. The hallway was colder than the back room, and the air smelled stale, like it hadn't been ventilated in years. The walls were damp to the touch, and I could hear my footsteps echoing off the concrete as I walked. As I reached the corner, I shone my light around it, expecting to see the end of the hallway, but instead the hallway kept going. I don't know why, but I kept walking. There was something about the whole thing that felt off, but at the same time, I couldn't stop myself from wanting to see where it led. After another minute of walking, I came to the end of the hallway, where there was another door. This one was metal, with a rusted latch and no handle. It looked even older than the first door. My heart was racing at this point, but again, curiosity got the better of me. I unlatched the door and pushed it open. Inside was a small room, maybe 10 by 10 feet, with bare concrete walls and a single light bulb hanging from the ceiling. The bulb wasn't on, but there was enough light from my phone to see the room was empty. Completely empty, except for one thing. A single chair sitting right in the middle of the room, facing the door. I froze. The chair looked like it had been there for years, old and rusted, with peeling paint and cobwebs hanging off the legs. It was just sitting there, like someone had been sitting in it, waiting, but there was no one around. I don't know what it was, but something about that room made my skin crawl. It wasn't just the emptiness, or the cold, or the fact that there was a random chair in the middle of the room. It was the feeling that I wasn't supposed to be there, like I had just walked into a place that wasn't meant to be found. I turned around to leave, but the door slammed shut behind me. I ran to the door, yanking at the latch, but it wouldn't open. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I could feel the panic setting in. I banged on the door, yelling for Emma, hoping she could hear me, but the walls were too thick. There was no way my voice was getting through. For a few minutes I just stood there, frozen, trying to figure out what to do. And then I heard it again, the tapping. Only this time it wasn't coming from the back room. It was coming from inside the room with me. I turned around, shining my light toward the chair. Nothing. The room was still empty, but the sound was getting louder, like something was tapping on the concrete floor, moving toward me. I backed up against the door, my hands shaking, as the sound grew closer and closer. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it. Something was there, in the room with me, getting closer. I don't know how long I stood there, but eventually, the tapping stopped. The room was silent again, except for the sound of my own breathing. And then, the door creaked open. I didn't wait to see what or who had opened it. I bolted out of the room, ran down the hallway, and slammed the first door shut behind me. My heart was racing, and I could barely catch my breath as I stumbled back into the back room. When I got to the front of the store, Emma asked if I was okay. I didn't tell her what had happened. I couldn't even explain it to myself. I never went back into that back room alone again, and I quit the job a few months later. To this day, I still don't know what was in that room or why that door was hidden behind the shelves. But sometimes, late at night, I think about it, and I wonder if there's more to that place than anyone ever realized.